The evolution of goths in pop culture. With their dark eyeliner, teased hair, upside-down crosses, gloomy demeanor, and all-black attire, the goth is instantly recognizable, and over the years they've become one of the most prominent archetypes in pop culture. This is a rather recent development, however, as goths were once so poorly perceived by the public that they were practically synonymous with the devil. Depictions of the subculture in the media have often been representative of society at large, with goths being associated with everything from grief to rebellion to undeniable wickedness. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at the evolution of the goth archetype in American media, including the subculture's historical influences, its rise in mainstream popularity, its basic style philosophy, the trope's symbolic meaning, and notable examples in film and TV. We'll also be examining the major differences between goth and the alternative subcultures it's often conflated with, like punk and emo. Now let's get into it. Traveling back in time to the 3rd century, the Roman Empire's control over its western territories was weakening, something attributed to the numerous nomadic tribes that were beginning to migrate to the area. At the time, the Roman forces were spread thin, and as a result, they were unable to manage these new arrivals, and with no loyalty to this perceived authority, these tribes revolted, embarking on a series of invasions that eventually led to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD. One Germanic tribe, known as the Goths, rose to power as a result, with their largest and most influential groups being the Visigoths, who settled in Spain, and the Ostrogoths, who established a new kingdom in Italy. As is custom, this new leadership wanted to distance itself from the prior one, resulting in the creation of their own art and architectural movements, with the latter incorporating the mosaics, metalwork, tall ceilings, and large windows that the Goths had encountered during their nomadic travels. This reign was rather short-lived, however, as the Ostrogoths were destroyed in the 6th century, and 200 years later, so were the Visigoths. By the beginning of the 9th century, the Holy Roman Empire made a triumphant return, officially bringing an end to the Goth dynasty, although it would take a few centuries for the region to fully stabilize. As they say, history is written by the victors, and with the Romans back on top, the Goths were depicted as heathens and barbarians who were intent on destroying a more sophisticated culture than their own. It was at this time that goth began to be used as a pejorative, and centuries later, during the Renaissance, artists and architects began using the term in reference to an aesthetic style that they had developed a distaste for. Earliest examples of said style were from the 1100s, often appearing in England, Germany, and France, with the latter serving as the inspiration for its original name, French work. The style's key architectural motifs included thin walls, pointed arches, high ceilings, and stained glass windows, all of which clashed with the artistic inclinations of the Italian Renaissance, which sought to pay homage to classical antiquity with simplicity, symmetry, and naturalism. The Gothic moniker wasn't exclusive to buildings either, as other late medieval art, like sculptures and tapestries, were given similar descriptions because of their perceived simplicity. Now, I'm being a bit hyperbolic, but the entire Renaissance movement sort of reads as 16th century MAGA, what with it largely revolving around this idea that the past was more civilized and cultured than the present. And in a case of extreme nationalism, in Italy, ancient Roman ideologies were positioned as superior to everything else, with anything foreign being considered barbaric. Sound familiar? Regardless of any actual relation, by renaming French work to Gothic in the 1500s, it developed a reputation for being outdated, gaudy, and crude, and it was eventually eclipsed by the Renaissance style, then Baroque, then Neoclassicism. In the late 18th century, the Romanticism movement sprung up, which saw a renewed interest in medieval art, architecture, and literature. As one of the defining architectural styles of the late Middle Ages, it was inevitable that there would be a Gothic revival, and the Catholic Church was one of its biggest proponents, ironically promoting it as a return to the traditional values that were being destroyed by recent industrialization. It was around this time that a new genre of literature was created, which merged romance with the macabre. One of the first examples was the novel The Castle of Otranto, which was written by Horace Walpole in 1764, following a nightmare he had in his own Gothic revival home. The story, which took place in a haunted castle, was initially presented as a translation of a 16th century manuscript, as contemporary readers found the idea of the supernatural to be inappropriate. After all, only silly peasants from the Middle Ages could possibly think that ghosts are real, and when Walpole later revealed himself as the original author, He was heavily criticized for humoring such ridiculous notions. Although The Castle of Otranto had a humorous tone, it included many elements that would come to define the genre, including murder, betrayal, love, curses, imprisonment, destruction, vengeance, religion, and duty. His choice in a Gothic setting was also incredibly influential, with the novels that came after him opting for a similar locale, eventually inspiring the name of the genre, Gothic fiction. Because the supernatural was still considered far-fetched, it took a few decades for Gothic fiction to pick up steam, but by the 1790s it had become a full-blown craze, with Anne Radcliffe being considered one of its pioneers. Often including psychological terror, sinister settings, ambiguously ancient time periods, attractive villains, and persecuted heroines, Radcliffe's novels set the standard, and in the years that followed, her works were widely imitated. The elements of Gothic fiction eventually became so recognizable that they were often subject to parody, with these stereotypical tropes being exaggerated for comic effect. In 1819, two influential Gothic works were published: Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which is now considered one of the first sci-fi novels, and John William Polidori's The Vampire, which turned the mythical creature from a bloodthirsty animal into the suave villain we know today. The latter was so popular that it set off a full-blown vampire craze, with the 1820s being riddled with operas, plays, and novels that mimicked the imagery seen in Polidori's story. Gothic fiction's mass appeal was a double-edged sword, as its ability to be enjoyed by the lower class gave it a reputation as low culture, ironically preserving the negative connotations Gothic had developed during the Renaissance. This led to the Gothic novel declining in popularity in favor of the more well-regarded historical fiction. But in the 1840s, the genre was revitalized in spite of the era's emphasis on realism. Throughout the remainder of the Victorian era, Gothic fiction prevailed, with the Bronte sisters, Charles Dickens, Edgar Allan Poe, and Oscar Wilde publishing wildly successful works that further established the Gothic aesthetic in modern times. By combining contemporary dilemmas with ancient myths, these stories explored the darkness in human nature, and by emphasizing desire, dread, and drama, there was a subversive quality that piqued people's interest. Gothic literature of the time period was also notable for its social and political commentary, alluding to taboo subjects like women's sexuality, the superficiality of high society, the effect of industrialization on tradition, and changing gender roles. Vampires made frequent appearances in Gothic fiction of the late Victorian era, often representing sexual promiscuity, moral degeneration, and unholy temptations. The most notable work of vampire fiction from this time period was undoubtedly Bram Stoker's Dracula, which not only introduced one of the most iconic Gothic villains, but also created an association between vampires and the Victorian era that remains today. In the early 1900s, the modernism movement brought along a wave of abstract and futuristic ideas, resulting in the rejection of bygone aesthetics like those found in Gothic literature and architecture. However, in the wake of World War I, people developed a morbid fascination with the idea of madness, betrayal, and death, familiar Gothic concepts that trickled into the era's literature, as well as the newly formed film industry. In the 1920s through the 1930s, pulp magazines were all the rage, being the spiritual successor of the cheap penny dreadfuls of the Victorian era that had regularly published Gothic fiction. These pulp magazines would feature retellings of famous Gothic works, as well as original horror stories that incorporated stereotypically Gothic themes. One of the most prominent pulp authors was H.P. Lovecraft, who specialized in fear of the unknown, and his own work was heavily inspired by the Gothic novels of the prior century. With early film audiences showing an interest in the melodramatic, Gothic stories often served as a point of reference cinematically, especially in Germany. With the German government banning foreign movies in 1916 because of the war, they had no choice but to develop their own film industry, which became distinctly dark and surreal. Unlike the American film industry, which opted for action-adventure or romance, German films of the 1920s were influenced by their post-war experience, with horror becoming one of their most popular genres. These German expressionist films rejected reality, opting for distorted backdrops that took notes from Gothic architecture, while the stories themselves were often inspired by Gothic fiction, with mythical creatures and damsels in distress. One of the most notable works from this time period was 1922's Nosferatu, an unofficial adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula, whose dramatic visuals proceeded to impact the entirety of early horror. In the 1930s, Numerous Gothic stories like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Dracula, and Frankenstein were successfully adapted by Hollywood, inspiring a boom of monster movies that continued into the 1940s and 50s, and introduced iconic characters like the Invisible Man, King Kong, and Imhotep the Mummy. Several actors like Bela Lugosi, Boris Karloff, and Lon Chaney made frequent appearances in these sorts of films, tying them to the Gothic genre forever. While musicals, dramas, and historical epics had already begun switching to color, Gothic horror remained in black and white well into the 1950s, something that tied into the genre's somber themes. However, this also gave the appearance of it being trapped in the past, and Gothic horror soon found itself competing with psychological thrillers for attention. Around this time, mass-produced paperbacks grew in popularity, but because of their predominantly female readership, they weren't held in very high regard. One of the most popular genres was Gothic romance, which, as the name suggests, combined tropes of 19th century Gothic literature with more contemporary smut. These stories often followed a similar formula, something that carried over into their artwork, with almost every Gothic romance novel from the time period featuring a cover with a fabulously dressed woman running away from a large castle in the middle of a storm. In the 1960s, Gothic returned to the big screen, but it had a new look. There was not only a good deal more color, but also violence and sex, which is something you could say about films from that time period in general. Visually, there were a lot of similarities to the paperback books of the era, as evidenced by the near-identical film posters, highlighting how recognizable and stereotypical Gothic aesthetics had become by this point in time. Regardless of when these films were set, they incorporated imagery from Gothic literature's biggest historical influences, namely the medieval period and the Victorian era, resulting in a good deal of red velvet, melted candles, suits of armor, waist-cinching corsets, well-dressed men, decaying skeletons, stone castles, giant mausoleums, and flowy nightgowns. With the Gothic genre being so distinct visually and thematically, media that poked fun at these elements began to pop up more frequently, resulting in the creation of the Addams Family, Dark Shadows, and the Munsters. These TV programs were unique in how they used traditional Gothic imagery in a humorous but heartfelt context, making it less of a symbol of wickedness and corruption, and more of an example of nonconformity. While the punk subculture had flourished in the early 1970s as a subversion of the disco craze, by the end of the decade, many musicians had become disillusioned with the movement, finding that its anti-establishment and anti-authoritarian message had become commercialized. This led to the rise of a post-punk sound, which took a more experimental approach by incorporating non-rock influences like funk beats, electronic synth, and religious hymns. For the majority of the 20th century, Gothic had been used to describe ancient cathedral music, the stuff with organs and harps and lutes that wouldn't have been out of place in an old-timey castle. But in the late 1970s, the term was used to describe one of the new sounds that had popped up during the post-punk era, one that was dark and unconventional. With its usage of reverb and distortion, early Gothic rock had a haunting quality to it, an idea that was solidified through its lyrics, which incorporated themes like existentialism, melancholy, religion, and the supernatural. Pioneers of this Gothic sound included Bauhaus, Nico, The Cure, Joy Division, The Sisters of Mercy, Christian Death, and Susie and the Banshees. One of the most well-known songs from this early period was the 1979 single Bela Lugosi's Dead, which served as an ode to Dracula and Gothic fiction in general, setting a precedent for the genre. And in the years that followed, numerous Gothic rock groups took to incorporating bats, blood, crosses, and skulls into their aesthetic. As Gothic rock grew, so did the goth fandom, eventually spawning an all-out counterculture movement that had its own magazines, clubs, and style philosophy.
What do you call yourselves?
Gothic.
What does that mean?
It's just the type of music we like and the way we dress and the makeup, like it's the whole effect.
Rebelling against adult expectations is a pretty normal part of adolescence, and many teens found themselves gravitating towards the goth scene, not only as a way of expressing themselves, but also in order to find a community of like-minded individuals. Young goths relished the idea of being different, and many elements of the subculture revolved around shocking normies, something they accomplished not only through their nihilistic worldview, but also through their attire. Like most subcultures rooted in music, goths of the early 1980s took inspiration from their favorite artists, with Susie Sue, Danielle Dax, Johnny Slut, Dave Vanian, Patricia Morrison, and Robert Smith serving as the blueprint for the goth look. With Gothic horror being heavily associated with the Victorian era, goths incorporated fashion trends from the time period like corsets, capes, top hats, chokers, and tailcoats, giving them a sort of modern-day Dracula type of vibe.
Do you have anything black? Or like pants with laces up the side of the leg? Would be good, just so you can still see the skin.
This Victorian influence could also be seen in goth's penchant for black, which besides contradicting the popular pastels and neons of the 1980s, also paid homage to Victorian mourning attire. Whether intended ironically or intentionally, the choice also implied that goths felt as dead inside as they looked on the outside. If you've been watching this channel for a while, then you know that this 19th century inspiration wasn't actually that unusual, as numerous trends from the 1980s were actually rehashed from the Victorian era. And if you look at non-goth artists like Adam Ant, Cyndi Lauper, Madonna, Prince, Lita Ford, and Tommy Lee, there was a good deal of overlap with goths visually, aside from the amount of color, of course. As such, the traditional goth look is a clear product of its time, being undeniably 1980s in origin and execution, with big hair, bold eyeshadow, and dramatic silhouettes. While punks used swastikas and expletives to offend the rest of the world, goths gravitated towards religious iconography. This direction was likely due to the religious influence that had been present in Gothic aesthetics since the Middle Ages, and goths proceeded to appropriate symbols from an array of religions, including Catholic, Buddhist, and pagan. Fetish wear was similarly incorporated into the goth look for shock value, with latex, studs, and fishnets alluding to the sexual undertones present in Gothic fiction. Another goth trend was white face makeup, whose popularity was attributed to a few different factors. The first was how it subverted the beauty standard of the time period, which was all about looking tan and athletic. The second was the sort of vampire effect that it had, making you look as though you hadn't seen the sun in years or had had all the blood sucked out of your body. The final reason was the contrast of the pale skin against the all-black clothing, which created a similar visual as the black and white films that help establish the Gothic horror genre. With the Gothic and the supernatural going hand in hand, many goths developed an interest in the occult, and this exploration of non-mainstream ideologies allowed them to further defy the status quo. The timing of this religious rebellion wasn't ideal, however, as satanic panic was starting to spread across the US, which saw various cockamamie conspiracies pop up that attributed cases of child abuse, teen suicide, and random acts of murder to Satanism. A sense of pop culture paranoia developed as a result, with Dungeons & Dragons, heavy metal music, and scary movies being referred to as tools of the devil. In one 1988 newspaper article, there was even a guide warning parents about common satanic symbols to keep an eye out for, which, as you can see, were staples of subversive goth fashion. And soon enough, all goths were being accused of being part of a satanic cult. Because the goth subculture was up and coming in the 1980s, the archetype didn't make many appearances on screen, although there were a handful of characters who showed some goth-adjacent proclivities. Violet in 1985's Friday the 13th, A New Beginning, initially reads as more new wave, but her darker color palette and religious iconography feels a touch more morbid. Allison in The Breakfast Club is sometimes called an early goth, but I'd argue that her penchant for black is just a representation of her generally depressed state. There's a strong argument to be made for David in 1987's The Lost Boys being the first movie goth, especially considering the film's gothic rock soundtrack and the character's vampirism, but I always felt as though he dressed more punk. If you ask me, it wasn't until 1988 that we began seeing our first batch of cinematic goths. A lesser-known character was Angela Franklin in Night of the Demons, whose new look had made her an outcast and gotten her labeled as a witch. Her interest in the occult winds up having dire consequences, making her more susceptible to demonic possession, and she's turned into a monster who is unable to differentiate friend from foe. It's not the most subtle metaphor. That same year, Mistress of the Dark was released, which followed horror hostess Elvira after she moves into an uptight suburban neighborhood. Elvira serves as a stand-in for all of society's outcasts, with the character being discriminated against simply because she doesn't fit in. But the film subverts expectations by presenting the townspeople as being in the wrong, not her. The Elvira character had first gained notoriety in the early 1980s on the LA-based TV program Movie Macabre, which saw her making sarcastic remarks about whatever B-movie was currently on air. The character's witty humor, sex appeal, and self-awareness made her very popular with horror fans, and with her revealing black dress and bouffant hairdo, she became a goth style icon. Now, Elvira wasn't the first of her kind, with Vampira of the Vampira show becoming the first horror hostess way back in the 1950s. As television grew more popular in America, more stations started showing their own horror programs, and a wide array of personas were created to host them, including Tarantula Ghoul, Mona Lisa, Satina, Crematia Mortem, and Elvira, of course. The most memorable goth character from 1988 was probably Lydia Dietz in Beetlejuice, who wasn't just an odd little girl with a penchant for dark clothing, but actually incorporated Victorian imagery into her look. Compared to other media depictions of goths, Lydia wasn't a villain. She was treated like a normal girl, just one who had slightly abnormal interests. The reason for this more positive depiction of gothdom is likely because of director Tim Burton, who was himself a fan of all things gothic, with the vast majority of his films being influenced by the genre thematically or visually. In the 1990s, goth evolved from a niche counterculture movement into a mainstream trend, something its pre-existing fandom wasn't too happy about. In the fashion space, goth-inspired clothing became more readily available thanks to brands like Demonia, Trip, and Lip Service, making it easier than ever to dress the part of a misfit. Gothic motifs also became popular in the high fashion world, with brands like Betsey Johnson, Valentino, Alexander McQueen, Christian Dior, Thierry Mugler, Anna Sui, and Chanel releasing moody collections that had Victorian and vampiric inspirations. With some people experimenting with goth style, but not actually showing an interest in the music, the fandom decided they needed to differentiate these wannabes from the real thing, leading to the moniker mall goth, so called because of their basic knowledge of the subculture, as well as their penchant for hanging out in shopping malls. Hot Topic was perhaps the best example of the commercialization of goth style, with the store becoming a one-stop shop for alternative fashion, frequently lumping together goth, grunge, and punk aesthetics, resulting in the mall goth looking quite different from the traditional goth. A slew of non-goth artists began incorporating gothic motifs into their music at this time, including Marilyn Manson, 9 Inch Nails, Meatloaf, Rob Zombie, and Evanescence. This created greater confusion amongst the general public, as they were no longer able to quickly differentiate gothic music from other genres like death rock, heavy metal, or industrial. This led to even more gatekeeping within the goth community, as the normies they had sought to separate themselves from were now considering themselves part of the club. In Hollywood, there was a gothic horror revival with adaptations of classic stories like Sleepy Hollow, Frankenstein, Jane Eyre, and The Pit and the Pendulum. The 1992 adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula was without a doubt the most popular of these films, and it was credited for revitalizing the public's interest in both vampires and gothic fiction, which inadvertently brought more attention to the goth scene. Other films like The Crow, Dark City, Strange Days, and Blade incorporated gothic imagery, but with a futuristic cyberpunk twist that deviated from the genre's typically Victorian inspirations. With goths becoming more commonplace, the character type began to appear with increased frequency in the media, usually serving as a representation of angst or otherness. This included Nancy in The Craft, Megan in Mirror Mirror, Tosh in Urban Legend, Sinead in But I'm a Cheerleader, and Rachel in The Rage, Carrie 2. The latter is notable in the fact that both Rachel and Carrie are outcasts, but in the 20 years since the first film's release, society's perception of that type of person had changed significantly. Because goths were often stereotyped as rebellious and moody, they were usually depicted as teenagers, with Tiffany in Bride of Chucky being a rare exception to the rule, with her gothic tendencies instead representing her sexuality and hot temper. Goths were also featured in children's cartoons, something the satanic panic theorists of the prior decade would have lost their heads over. Some of the earliest examples included Cassandra in Hercules the Animated Series, Andrea in Daria, the Hex Girls in Scooby-Doo, and Kylie in Extreme Ghostbusters, although the Hex Girls are probably the best remembered. Self-described eco-goths, their storyline actually poked fun at the public's misconceptions about the subculture, with Mystery Inc. presuming the girls are actual witches just because of their appearance. Although goths had become more visible, they were still a novelty out in the real world, as evidenced by their frequent appearances on 90s talk shows, with hosts like Oprah Winfrey, Ricki Lake, and Jenny Jones grilling them about their style, and even pushing them to get makeovers to look normal. As is pretty standard for those sorts of shows, there wasn't much emphasis on how their clothing was a form of self-expression. Instead, everyone seemed hung up on how scary or weird they looked. With all of this increased recognition, it seemed as though goths were about to go from outcasts to superstars, but following the Columbine massacre in 1999, they were once again persona non grata, in large part due to the killers being erroneously identified as part of the goth scene. As a result, anti-goth sentiment spread across the country, no longer being misfits, but full-blown maniacs with mental illness, and many goths from the time period have said that they were even threatened with physical violence because of the way they were dressed. Although real-life goths continued to be discriminated against in the early 2000s, in film and TV, they were everywhere. Abby in NCIS introduced a new goth character type, the perky goth, who proved that just because you enjoyed the darkness, it didn't mean you were automatically depressed. Although she had stereotypically goth interests, she refused to let it define her, even correcting people when they tried to reduce her to just the goth girl. Ginger Snaps, White Oleander, Gypsy 83, Homeroom, and My First Mister placed goths front and center, with the films using the trope as a way of exploring female sexuality, identity, and mental health. By making all of these goths teen girls, it tied the aesthetic to a specific form of adolescence, implying that it was just a phase that they would someday grow out of. Of course, there were still the occasional goth villains, as seen in Blair Witch 2 and Final Destination 3, but it was pretty obvious that they were inspired by Columbine. Although gothic horror wasn't that popular in the 2000s, there were a good deal of gothic action films like Underworld, Dracula 2000, Repo the Genetic Opera, and Queen of the Damned, which incorporated the sort of dingy, futuristic goth look that had been popularized in the 1990s. There were also dozens of animated goth girls, with these edgy characters serving as many Gen Zers' introduction to the subculture. Several TV shows, including The Oblongs, X-Men Evolution, Clone High, The Venture Brothers, Total Drama Island, Danny Phantom, Growing Up Creepy, and Invader Zim, had characters who wore dark clothing, were often pessimistic, had an interest in the paranormal, and didn't stick to the status quo. Now, many of them didn't actually show an interest in the gothic music scene, but that was largely due to the restrictions of the medium, and it's more so their appearance, interests, and attitude that make them goth-coded. Now, I'd completely understand if you don't consider Shigo and Raven actual goth girls, but I also don't think you should be tarred and feathered for thinking the opposite, especially when that was clearly the production's intention. After all, what could be a better visual shorthand for this character is a moody teenager than a subculture that had long been associated with angst? Speaking of angst, the 2000s ushered in a second wave of pop-punk music, which was characterized by edgy themes of self-discovery, rebellion, and heartbreak paired alongside upbeat melodies. This wasn't all that different from the rising emo pop genre, and I'd consider them two sides of the same coin, even sharing the same fan bases. Just as gothic rock had inspired its own subculture back in the 80s, so did the emo scene in the 2000s. Emo fashion was essentially a contemporary take on 1970s punk, sharing similar graphic tees, studded accessories, a multitude of piercings, and tight pants, but with hoodies instead of leather jackets, Converse instead of combat boots, and side-swept bangs instead of mohawks. Unlike punks, who like to draw attention to themselves, emos were characterized as introverted, being more likely to hang out in their rooms than on street corners. Similar to how mall goths were derided as goth posers, fake emos who seemed to only be interested in the aesthetic were derided as scene queens, which eventually spun off into its own subculture. Thanks to the internet, specifically MySpace, the emo subculture took on a life of its own, spreading across the country like wildfire. Compared to gothic rock, pop punk and emo pop were able to appeal to a much younger audience, something that prompted backlash from parents because of the genre's bleak message.
Nobody understands what I'm going through, especially you!
With gothic rock having similar cynical undertones, emos and goths were often considered one and the same, causing derision between the two subcultures. This feud even culminated in an all-out battle in Mexico in 2008 when groups of emos, punks, and goths took to the streets to assert their dominance over each other. Although there were some differences, I actually think emos and goths had a good deal in common with one another, something that was actually joked about on South Park.
Goth's darkness is nihilistic, whereas emos is cynical.
Wait, I thought we were cynical.
Sure, goth is more moody and mysterious because of its horror inspirations, but the core of both movements is freedom of expression. Emos are just more focused on the emotional, while goths are focused on the ideological. Now, I'm by no means saying that they look and sound the same, but that's because they're products of their time. And I'd bet if a group of goths and emos gave each other a chance, they'd get along fine. Although goths had a good deal of screen time in the 90s and 2000s, they became less common in the 2010s and 2020s, in large part because the subculture wasn't as controversial as it had once been, making it less of a statement for a character to be goth. The few that did appear in film and TV usually fell into one of 4 categories. Each of these archetypes related to different assumptions that had arisen about goths over the years. The witchy goths, who had appeared in the media since the 1980s, alluded to the supernatural themes of the gothic aesthetic, as well as the popular misconceptions that all goths were Satanists. The cringy goth was a reflection of how the public perceives people who don't conform to societal expectations, with their earnest desire to be an individual being considered embarrassing. The sexualized goth was simply a result of the subculture's visual aesthetic being similar to fetish wear, as well as the stereotype that goths were promiscuous. As for the badass goth, they were also given punk quirks, allowing that subculture's penchant for chaos to direct the character. Goths have also been used as an indicator of time period, with movies that take place in the 1980s often including a goth character, which I do think is pretty funny considering the trend wasn't that well known at the time. Although a good deal of male characters have influenced the goth look over the years, like Dracula, Edward Scissorhands, and Eric Draven, actual male goths don't make very many appearances in media, with the few examples including Gary King in The World's End, Cheyenne in This Must Be the Place, Eli Goldsworthy in Degrassi, Loki in Son of the Mask, and Ian McKinley in Final Destination 3. This is likely because the goth look of long hair and dark makeup is still considered feminine in the mainstream. And with superhero physiques being all the rage in Hollywood, there's no demand for male goths, which is a shame because have you seen Pedro Pascal as a goth? The biggest problem I have with Hollywood's goth archetype is the complete lack of diversity, with the number of non-white goths being in the single digits. Now, in the real world, the reaction to goths of color seems to be varied, with some saying that they felt excluded by the community, while others have said they've been accepted with open arms. Now, I can't speak for the entire subculture, but if movies are to be believed, you'd think that black goths didn't exist. Thankfully, because of social media, we've been able to see more of this representation, something that's coincided with the rise of goth style in certain online circles in the 2020s. However, it's also drawn criticism from some elder goths because of the trend's perceived dismissal of the music genre. But I have to ask, how do you expect people to learn if you knock them down when they're just getting started? Does it really matter what came first if they wind up appreciating the entire subculture? Is it so wrong for someone to become interested in the goth scene for its clothing when others got interested in it for the music? They're both inherently material. Although they've only been around for half a century, goths have experienced a good deal of discrimination, so I can understand why people are protective over it. But it's important to remember that everyone has to start somewhere, and isn't it better to be supportive instead of discouraging? Or is being different the only thing that matters? It's not like goth is some big secret anymore, not when there are entire doll lines that employ the aesthetic. Who are some of your favorite goth characters? I hope you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye!